My son called me a confused old widow while he stole my late husband's most prized possession right from my hands. He thought he could have me declared incompetent and take everything. He was my only child, pretending to care for me in my grief, but he was secretly selling off my husband's memories to cover his massive secret debts. But what he didn't know was that the watch he pawned was actually a key to a brilliant trap my husband left behind. And I was about to use it to deliver the most satisfying justice he never saw coming. The house is too quiet now. It's a silence that has weight pressing down in a way it never did when Arthur was here puttering in his study or reading the Wall Street Journal in his worn leather chair. I've taken to sitting in that chair myself, mostly because it still holds the faint scent of his cologne and the pipe tobacco he loved. In my hands, I hold his watch, a gold Rolex, heavy and solid and real. It's not just a timepiece. It's a monument to a life of hard work and meticulous planning. He bought it the day he sold his company, the culmination of 40 years of effort. He used to say it didn't just tell time, it kept a record of it. Every tick was a moment he'd earned for us. I run my thumb over the cool, smooth crystal feeling, the familiar heft of it in my palm. It's the closest I can get to holding his hand now. The sound of a sports car crunching on the gravel driveway shatters the peace. That's Brian. He doesn't drive a car, he pilots a statement. He enters the house with a gust of chilly autumn air and an even chillier smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. It's the smile of a man performing the role of a concerned son. He kisses my cheek, but his gaze is already scanning the room, assessing things. Since the funeral, he and his wife Allison have been a constant presence, smothering me with a kind of aggressive care that feels more like a siege. He starts right in his voice, a smooth, practiced baritone. He tells me I shouldn't be troubling myself with the mail, with the bills. He explains that managing an estate of this size is complex, full of tax implications and fiduciary duties that would overwhelm anyone, let alone someone in my fragile state. It's classic Greenwich talk, where every conversation, even about grief, eventually becomes about asset management. He talks about the rising property taxes, the importance of maintaining our membership at the club for social standing, all the pressures Arthur handled so effortlessly. Now he insists that burden falls to him. He's just trying to protect me, he says. Protect me from what? From my own life. He sorts through the mail on the mahogany sideboard, creating neat piles. I see the distinctive cream-colored envelope from Davies & Associates, Arthur's longtime estate lawyer. Before I can say a word, Brian slides it into his own briefcase. He reassures me it's just standard legal boilerplate formalities he'll take care of. My husband was a man who despised boilerplate. Every word in every document he ever signed was deliberate, weighed, and measured. A small, cold knot tightens in my stomach, but I say nothing. Arguing takes energy I simply don't have. It's easier to nod to seem frail and agreeable. It's what he expects. Then his eyes land on the Rolex in my hand. His smile tightens a fraction. He says he was just thinking about the watch. As a significant asset, he explains it needs to be professionally serviced and appraised for the estate's valuation. It's a matter of procedure, he tells me, using that tone one uses on a child. He even has the paperwork ready from a highly recommended jeweler in town. He places a single sheet of paper and a pen on the table in front of me. He calls it a simple insurance and release form for the jeweler. Just a formality. My hand trembles slightly as I sign. It feels like a surrender. He carefully places the watch into a soft velvet pouch and tucks it into his coat pocket. He pats my shoulder, tells me I've done the right thing, and that he'll handle everything. That night's sleep is a distant country I can't seem to reach. The house groans around me, each sound amplified by the emptiness. Around 2 in the morning, I get up for a glass of water, and I hear a low, frantic murmur coming from the downstairs hallway. It's Brian. His voice is stripped of its smooth confidence, replaced by a raw, ragged desperation I've never heard before. I stand motionless in the dark at the top of the stairs listening. The words come in broken, panicked fragments. He thinks I'm asleep. He thinks he's safe. But I hear him clearly. I hear him say, the watch only got him 30 grand. I hear him say he needs the rest by Friday or they're going to... His voice trails off into a choked whisper. And then the words that freeze the blood in my veins. No, she has no idea. She signs whatever I put in front of her. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. I didn't go back to bed to sleep. I went back to think. The shock of my son's words from the hallway hadn't made me weak or hysterical. It had done the opposite. It was like a splash of ice water snapping me out of the hazy fog of grief I'd been living in for months. The sadness was still there, a heavy stone in my chest. But now it was surrounded by something else, a cold, clear, and sharp-edged anger. Lying in the dark, I thought about Arthur. My husband was the most meticulous man I'd ever known. He had contingency plans for his business, for our investments, even for a simple vacation. It was impossible for me to believe that he wouldn't have had a plan for this, for the one weakness he always saw, but could never fix our son's character. Brian's greed wasn't new, only the desperation was. Arthur must have known. He must have prepared for it. And as I stared at the ceiling, a plan began to form in my mind, not my plan, but his. I just needed to pull the first thread. The next morning, the atmosphere at the breakfast table was thick with false cheerfulness. Brian was talking loudly about the stock market, while Allison, his wife, nervously rearranged the silverware beside her plate. They were both performing and doing a terrible job of it. I played my own part, the fragile, slightly confused widow. I picked at my toast and let my gaze drift around the room as if lost in a sad memory. Then I found my moment. I looked directly at Allison, whose nerves were already frayed to a breaking point. I told her in a soft, wavering voice that something had been troubling me. I explained I was thinking about Arthur's watch. I then began to spin the lie I had crafted in the dark, a story made of just enough truth to be plausible. I said Arthur always told me the watch's serial number was special, that it was tied to his old naval service number. I told her I needed that number for some pension records. I had to file a bit of tedious but necessary paperwork. I asked her so sweetly if she could please ask Brian to get it for me from the jeweler. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. All the color drained from Allison's face. She looked like a cornered animal. She knew the watch wasn't at any jeweler, but she clearly had no idea about the lie I'd just told. She stammered something about the appraisal taking longer than expected, that it was a very complex piece. Her excuse was clumsy and completely contradicted the story Brian had told me about a simple cleaning. Before she could dig herself a deeper hole, Brian stormed over to the table. His voice was harsh. He demanded to know why I was obsessing over the watch. He said I was getting confused, that my grief was making me paranoid. His aggression was a confession. The concerned son was gone, replaced by a panicked bully. He was trying to shut me down, to frighten me back into my role as the helpless old woman. It was the confirmation I needed. I let my eyes fill with tears, my lower lip tremble. I looked utterly wounded by his cruelty. I stood up from the table, swaying slightly, and whispered that I felt dizzy and needed to lie down. It was the perfect excuse. Allison rushed to help me, full of flustered apologies, but I waved her away. Alone in my bedroom, I didn't lie down. I walked to my closet, reached into the very back of my jewelry box, and pulled out the old, simple flip phone Arthur had insisted I keep charged for emergencies. I dialed the number for Mr. Davies, our lawyer, from memory. When his secretary answered, my voice was no longer frail. It was steady and firm. I told her to give him a message. I said to tell him that Arthur's watch is gone. And then I said the two words Arthur had made me memorize for a day. I prayed would never come, it's time. I finished by telling her he should call me on this number in exactly 1 hour, then I hung up. My performance had been a little too convincing. When I came back downstairs an hour later, Brian was waiting for me. His face was a tight mask of manufactured concern, but his eyes were cold with suspicion. He told me he'd been worried about my episode and had made some decisions for my own good. He said that for my own safety, he would be holding onto my car keys. Then he held out his hand for my smartphone, explaining that I needed to rest free from the stress of constant calls and notifications. He had found me out. He knew I was suspicious. The gilded cage my son had built around me with his feigned concern was now a real prison with him as the warden. He thought he had me trapped. But he had no idea that Arthur's final plan was already in motion. To win a war, you sometimes have to lose a battle on purpose. The next morning, I put on my best performance of a defeated woman. I found Brian in the study looking over spreadsheets on his laptop with a deep frown. I approached him slowly, leaning on the doorframe as if for support. I told him, my voice soft and raspy, that I had done a lot of thinking. I apologized. I said he was right, that my grief was a heavy cloud that made me confused and suspicious of the very people trying to help me. I told him I was ashamed of how I had treated him and Allison, and that from now on, I would trust him to handle things. I would stay out of the way. I just needed to rest. The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost comical. He wanted to believe it so badly that he didn't even question it. He walked me to my room, assuring me that I was doing the right thing, that he would take care of everything. He closed the door, and I was left in the quiet solitude of my prison, which was quickly becoming my headquarters. What I couldn't see, but what I can picture so clearly now, was the depth of the terror that was driving him. While I was playing the part of the broken mother, he was living in a private hell. His phone would buzz with messages that weren't from clients or friends, but from the kind of lenders who don't use official letterhead. I can see him opening a text message, his hand trembling, to see a picture of his own beautiful Greenwich home, his children's playhouse visible in the background, with a caption underneath that was both simple and chilling: "We know where you live. Friday." I can see the memory that must have haunted his every waking moment, a single disastrous options trade on a volatile tech stock, a gamble he was sure would solve everything that instead cost him a fortune he never had. He wasn't just greedy. He was a drowning man, and he saw me not as his mother, but as a life raft he could tear apart to stay afloat for another minute. As I sat on my bed, the quiet of the room was broken by a soft vibration. It was the hidden phone. On the screen, a single name, Mr. Davies. I answered, and his voice was the calm in my storm. He confirmed he had received my message and that Arthur's instructions were now in effect. He spoke of my late husband with a mixture of professional reverence and genuine friendship. He told me Arthur had prepared for this possibility for years. He then directed me to Arthur's old writing desk, to a specific carved panel on the left side. He told me to press it in and then slide it to the right. I did as he instructed, and with a soft click, a hidden compartment I never knew existed opened up. Inside was a small, locked metal box. The key, he told me, was taped to the underside of the desk drawer. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, there was no jewelry or cash. It was something far more valuable: documents. There were bank statements for an account with a local credit union under my name alone, containing over $50,000 Arthur's emergency fund for me, and beneath them a single heavy brass key with a numbered tag. Mr. Davies explained that it was for a safe deposit box, and that what was inside that box was the true heart of Arthur's plan. He told me to stay strong, to keep playing my part, and that he would handle the rest. He would be in touch. Downstairs, Brian was radiating a new, unbearable arrogance. He had won. He had faced a moment of rebellion from his confused, grieving mother and had expertly brought her back under control. I could hear him talking to Allison in the kitchen, his voice dripping with condescending pride. He told her that he knew what was best, that a firm hand was all that was needed. He said I had completely forgotten about the watch and would now be perfectly compliant. Then through the floorboards I heard him make a phone call. His tone shifted to one of legal formality. It was to his own lawyer. I heard him say the words clearly, confidently. He was instructing his attorney to proceed with filing the petition for an immediate temporary conservatorship over my affairs, citing my deteriorating mental state. He hung up the phone, believing he had just checkmated me. He had no idea he'd just walked his own king directly into my trap. For 2 days, I existed in the suffocating quiet of my own home, a prisoner tended to by her jailer. Brian was sickeningly attentive, bringing me meals on trays, fluffing my pillows, and speaking to me in a gentle, condescending tone that made my skin crawl. He thought he had won. He believed his little show of force had quelled my momentary confusion, and now he was simply waiting for the courts to make his control official. He had no idea he was a dead man walking. I was patient. Arthur had taught me the power of patience, of letting your opponent make the final fatal error on his own. My waiting came to an end on a crisp Wednesday afternoon when the doorbell rang. Brian, annoyed at the interruption, went to answer it. I heard his voice shift from irritation to confused formality. I stood at the top of the stairs watching. There stood Mr. Davies, my husband's lawyer and friend for over 40 years, his expression grim and resolute. Beside him was a stern-faced woman in a severe navy suit whom I didn't recognize. They stepped inside, and the atmosphere in the house changed instantly, charging with a tension that was almost electric. Brian tried to take control, telling them it wasn't a good time and that his mother was resting and not to be disturbed. Mr. Davies simply ignored him. He looked past Brian and met my eyes at the top of the stairs. I gave a single slow nod and descended. I walked into the living room and sat in Arthur's chair, folding my hands in my lap. Brian and Allison followed their faces, a mixture of confusion and dawning fear. Mr. Davies didn't waste time with pleasantries. He placed a thick envelope on the coffee table and informed Brian he was being served with a cease and desist letter demanding the immediate withdrawal of his baseless conservatorship petition. Brian began to bluster, accusing Mr. Davies of manipulating a grieving, confused woman. But Mr. Davies just held up a hand, silencing him. He then produced another document, a copy of the final amendment to Arthur's will and trust. And then the first bombshell dropped. Mr. Davies began to explain that Arthur's Rolex was never just a piece of jewelry. It was, he stated in a calm, devastatingly clear voice, the sole access key to a private hidden trust fund. A trust fund containing $3 million. Allison gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Brian stared, his face turning a blotchy, sick shade of pale. He was looking at the lawyer, but I could tell he was seeing the ghost of his father. Before Brian could even form a response, the second, more terrible blow landed. Mr. Davies explained that my husband, knowing his son's nature, had attached a very specific duress clause to the trust. He had legally defined the watch being sold or pawned as an undeniable act of betrayal or coercion against his wife. The moment that pawnshop transaction was registered, An automatic alert was sent directly to his law firm. That single greedy act triggered a cascade of consequences that Arthur himself had designed. First, it immediately and irrevocably invoked a disinheritance clause, striking Brian's name from the will entirely. Second, it instantly dissolved the original trust and transferred the entire $3 million into a new ironclad trust under my sole and absolute control. And third, to protect the estate from any further fraud, it automatically forwarded the details of the suspicious asset transfer to the Internal Revenue Service for a full investigation. That was when he broke. It wasn't a gradual collapse. It was a detonation. The polished, arrogant shell of Brian Parker Greenwich financial consultant shattered into a million pieces, and all that was left was the terrified, pathetic man underneath. A raw, guttural sob tore from his throat, and he crumpled to the floor, curling into a ball on the expensive Persian rug. He confessed everything. The words poured out of him in a torrent of shame and terror, the disastrous options trade, the six-figure debt, the loan sharks and their threats, the lies he'd told everyone. He admitted to pawning the watch, to planning the conservatorship, to seeing me as nothing more than an obstacle between him and the money he needed to survive. Allison just stood there, white-faced and trembling, watching the complete and total annihilation of her life and the man she married. I let the terrible silence hang in the air for a long moment. Then I stood up. The fragile, grieving widow was gone forever. I looked down at the sobbing wreck of my son, and my voice when I spoke was not loud, but it was harder and colder than steel. I told him he had 24 hours to personally call his lawyer and withdraw the conservatorship petition. I informed him that after he had done that, he and his wife were to meet me at Mr. Davies' office the following morning at 10 o'clock sharp, where we would discuss the final consequences of his actions. I turned without another word and walked toward the study, leaving him to drown in the ruins of the world he had just destroyed. The war wasn't over, but the decisive battle had just been won. The walk into Mr. Davies' office felt like the final scene of a play that had been written long ago. The air inside the boardroom was cool and smelled of expensive leather and old books. It was a room built for consequences. Brian and Allison were already there, sitting on one side of the massive mahogany table. They looked like ghosts. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes empty. My son, who had always been so proud of his tailored suits and confident posture, was slumped in his chair, a shrunken, defeated man. I took my seat opposite them with Mr. Davies at the head of the table. I felt a profound and weary calm. The anger had burned away, leaving behind only the cold, clear certainty of what had to be done. Brian began to speak, his voice a hoarse croak. He started with a pathetic, rambling apology, not for the betrayal, but for getting caught. He talked about the immense pressure he was under, the bad decisions he'd made, as if he were a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of his own ruin. He was still searching for an angle, a sliver of pity he could exploit for a lifeline. It was in the middle of this self-serving monologue that the boardroom door opened. Mr. Davies' secretary showed two men into the room. They were not the brutish thugs I might have imagined. They were worse. They were dressed in immaculate, expensive suits, their faces placid and unreadable. They moved with a silent, predatory grace, and their eyes, as they settled on Brian, were as cold and dead as a winter sky. Brian froze mid-sentence, the blood draining from his face. He recognized them. These were the men from the phone call, the source of his terror. I explained, my voice cutting through the sudden thick silence, that I had instructed Mr. Davies to invite them. I felt it was only fair that all the interested parties in my son's financial affairs be present for this final accounting. The true reckoning began. Mr. Davies, acting as the calm and methodical executor of my husband's will, laid out the ruin of Brian's life piece by devastating peace. First, he slid a document across the table. It was the formal notice of disinheritance, legally severing Brian from Arthur's estate. He told Brian his signature was a mere formality. The act was already legally binding. Next, he informed my son that his confession of fraud, admitting he had attempted to secure my assets to pay off illegal debts, created a legal and ethical obligation. The firm would be filing reports with the State Financial Board and the SEC, an action that would permanently revoke his professional licenses and end his career. Finally, he gave an update on the IRS. The investigation was already active, and charges of financial fraud and attempted elder exploitation were not just possible, but likely. With every word, Brian seemed to shrink further, a man being systematically erased before our very eyes. But the true judgment didn't come from the lawyer. It came from the man in the expensive suit sitting beside him. He spoke in a low, almost polite voice that was more terrifying than any shout. He stated that it had now become clear that Brian's expected financial resources would not be materializing. Therefore, their arrangement would be moving into the collections phase. He said they would be exploring alternative methods to ensure the debt was honored. The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. In that moment, Brian wasn't just disinherited or disgraced, he was forfeit. He had been weighed, measured, and found wanting, and now he was being handed over to the consequences. That's when he turned to me, his last and final hope. The terror in his eyes was absolute. He fell out of his chair and onto his knees, crawling toward me. He wept not with remorse, but with pure animal fear. He begged me. He called me Mommy, a name he hadn't used in 40 years. He pleaded with me to use the money, the $3 million, to pay these men off, to make the IRS go away, to buy back his life. He promised he would be a better son, that he would do anything I asked. He was trying to sell the last thing he had left, his place in my heart. I looked down at my only child, this stranger, kneeling at my feet. For a fleeting moment, I saw the little boy I had raised. But he was gone, replaced by this desperate man who had been willing to strip me of my home, my dignity, and my freedom for his own gain. The grief I felt in that moment was for the son I had lost long ago. I stood up, and my voice was devoid of all emotion except a profound finality. I told him that the money Arthur left was meant to protect me from him, not to save him from himself. I told him he was on his own. I turned and walked out of the boardroom without looking back, leaving him on the floor, a broken man, surrounded by the predators he had invited into our lives. As the heavy door clicked shut behind me, it was the sound of the end. I didn't wait to see what happened next. As the boardroom door clicked shut behind me, I walked with Mr. Davies down the long, quiet hall and didn't look back. While we waited for the elevator, I glanced through the large windows overlooking the building's entrance. I saw them emerge onto the street below, the two men in their expensive suits flanking my son. They weren't holding him, but their presence was a cage more secure than any iron bars. Brian looked small and gray, his face a mask of pure, vacant terror. They guided him to a black town car waiting at the curb, one of them placing a firm hand on the back of his neck as he stumbled inside. The car pulled smoothly into traffic and disappeared. It was the last time I ever saw him. A few weeks later, a small article in the business section of the local paper noted that a once prominent financial consultant, Brian Parker, was facing federal fraud charges. The consequences were no longer just a family matter. They were a matter of public record. 6 months passed. The world turned, the seasons changed, and a new reality settled over us all. The great silent house in Greenwich, which had become my prison, was sold. I found the process of packing up 40 years of memories to be not sad, but liberating. I was shedding a skin, leaving behind the weight of a life that no longer fit. I received one phone call from Allison. She wasn't calling to ask for money or to make excuses for Brian. She was calling to say that she had taken their children and moved back to Ohio to be with her own family. Her voice was tired but steady. She was starting over, trying to build something real from the wreckage. I wished her peace. As for Brian, his life became a cautionary tale whispered at country clubs and dinner parties. His social and professional world evaporated overnight. He was a pariah entangled in a web of legal battles with the IRS and the SEC that would consume whatever was left of his life. I never learned exactly what happened with the lenders, but I know that men like that always collect their debts, one way or another. The family dynamic wasn't just changed, it was gone. A branch of our family tree had withered and died because its roots were rotten. My new life began in a beautiful condominium overlooking the Long Island Sound. It was a smaller space, but it was filled with light and air and the sound of the ocean. The quiet that had once felt like an oppressive weight now felt like peace. With Mr. Davies' help, I used a significant portion of the trust money, Arthur's final gift, to establish a foundation in his name. We called it the Arthur Parker Foundation for Veterans Financial Literacy, a way to use his legacy of careful planning to help those who had served our country. It gave me a purpose beyond my own grief and anger. I reconnected with friends I had drifted away from. I joined a book club I traveled. I learned to paint. I was no longer just a widow or a mother. I was Evelyn again. Tonight, we held the first official charity event for the foundation. The room was buzzing with warmth and laughter, filled with good people, my friends, fellow board members, the veterans we were helping. These people who respected and valued me for who I was had become my true family. After giving a short speech, I stood by the window looking out at the glittering water. Someone touched my arm, and I turned to see an old friend smiling at me. I smiled back, a genuine, easy smile. As I raised my glass in a toast, the light caught the watch on my wrist. It wasn't the Rolex. It was a simple, slender timepiece with a worn leather band, the one Arthur had given me on our very first wedding anniversary. Its value wasn't in its gold or its gears, but in its time. All the years it had faithfully kept for us. I ran my thumb over its smooth, familiar face. I had honored my husband's memory not with vengeance, but by finally becoming the strong, independent, and peaceful woman he had always believed me to be. And I was finally free. In the quiet aftermath, the truest lesson emerged. Justice, it turned out, wasn't about the satisfaction of revenge, but the simple, undeniable weight of consequences. Evelyn didn't have to become cruel to win. She simply had to step aside and let her son be crushed by the avalanche of his own greed. Her husband's greatest gift was not the fortune he left behind, but the brilliant plan that preserved her peace while ensuring his son met his own fate. A person's character, in the end, is a current that will always carry them to the shore they deserve.